So the title today is Digital Literacies, Knowledge, Skills and Attitudes for a Digital Age. And the reason I'm so passionate about this topic is because it's needed by everyone in society. It's needed by young children, primary school, high school, university students, university academics, and also every grouping in society. And I don't believe it's an option anymore. But how do we actually address it? Because as we know, things are moving so fast. And so how do we cope with the changes in technology and what do we do with this? And I think that's always been a concern. So what I wanted to start with are just some guiding words from Ruth. And staggering words in some ways in terms of the visionary nature. A reminder and a challenge to examine and re-examine the ends and means of education. And if you look over on the right-hand side, you've got a Mobius strip. And it actually happens to be the logo of my institute. For those who know that, it's got no start and end point, and the surface that you can actually go around on looks at the means and ends, I think, of education, that it's a never-ending journey. Also, too, in the recent book, we've got the emphasis on holistic teaching. And again, a lot of these are very new today. Let alone 30, 40 years ago when they were being discussed by Ruth. So I think there's some interesting guiding words. For this topic today, I found this interesting, and these are two more quotes. With the development of educational technology, other methods than the lecture could be used to enrich classroom teacher. Now this was mentioned by Ruth back in 1976, and the enrichment idea is very new today. Often technology is seen as an add-on, a delivery mode and so forth. And you can see there on the right-hand side, IVLE, and also too the clever way you're using it at NUS in terms of the applications where you're getting students to make apps as well, which I think is very innovative. Down the bottom, some beautiful learning spaces, the physical ones. The other quote I like here is about the quality. It will involve changes and improvement in instructional methods and methods besides those in physical facilities. And as we know, it's so important these days for all of our students to actually go to different places, to learn different concepts, to actually be savvy, if you like, with the environment in terms of the technology so that we can connect. And so I think these resonated with me when I was looking through some of the writings about Ruth. One other one, and because I work in a research and innovation institute at the moment, and I've got the luxury of looking at innovations and researching them, particularly in learning and teaching, this one was interesting. Looking at the idea of educational research. So starting to obtain services of those who had not only some training abroad, but had thought through local problems and issues. And design-based research, which we focus on in my institute, is about that, looking at real-world problems and looking at the issues that we can actually solve. And as we all know, how do we select the right problems for attention? And I think we're all looking at that in both our teaching and our research. On the right-hand side, I'll come back to this as some of the focus in the institute I look at, which is in digital futures. So a couple of comments there that I thought resonated in terms of what I was going to speak about today. The educational technology, the fact that we're not just looking at physical facilities, and also selecting the right problems to focus on, because that's the important thing we need to do in education. Okay, what I wanted to look at today is give you a little bit of a perspective of where I come from, my background, so that you can see the flavour going through. We'll look at this digital future, or this digital age. What do we need to be able to do in this particular time? I'll look at this idea of the digital literacies landscape because most countries around the world are struggling with this. How do we upskill? How do we actually have the knowledge that we need? I'll look then at my institute and what we're trying to do in this particular area because it is a focus of what we're doing. It is in our vision to look at digital literacies. And then I'll finish with, do we need new mindsets in how we actually go about this? So that's the roadmap, if you like, and the landscape for this particular presentation as we're going through. For my background, and besides the activities that were mentioned, I do some work during the day, and I come at things from a design point of view. I look at the educational technology and the innovation. And these are the intersections, if you like, in my work. In terms of what I try to examine is authentic learning interactions. I try to look at real-world problems, real-world interactions, and look at this authenticity, which I know is a theme here in Singapore as well. I also like to look at solving real-world problems. Time is too short not to focus on the big issues that we need to look at in education and in the use of a digital future. Also transformation, how do we actually make some change? And also trying to have some leadership in there, examining how leaders look at that and hopefully then setting a way forward in terms of that as well. So that's my background in terms of the focus that you'll probably see a flavour as we've got coming through this. So what do we mean by a digital future? Very ambiguous word, very ambiguous concept, but we're all going to be struggling with this in terms of the future, in terms of learning and teaching and just living. And I think this is particularly interesting. I often start here, and we were talking over lunch today about 3D printing. And we're talking about some other types of things as well that we're looking at in terms of the different apps. I've picked here the technology outlook for Australian tertiary education to give you the flavour, 2013-2018. Learning analytics, and I'll come back to that more on Monday when I talk about personalised learning, about how we can actually get feedback. The massive open online courses, which you guys are looking at NUS, and looking at it in a blended mode, and it's an opportunity for you to have a discussion about what you can do in technology spaces. Mobile learning, as we know, is here, but are we savvy enough to know how we can actually use it? And I'll come back to that point in a moment. The social media side, and all of this is the 1 year or less, at least in Australia and New Zealand. You've got the 3D printing, the badges, where we look at different ways. And we spoke over lunch as well about the Internet of Things, when you can actually walk into your house and the music turns on to your favourite song, the temperature goes to what you need, the grass needs watering, so it's got sensors, all of these sorts of things. So it's this biofeedback loop, or feedback loop, to actually how we do things. Some of the exciting things, the wearable technology, I think is interesting, where that's going in terms of embedding things in our clothes and on our body, and the watches that are coming out instead of the phones. So I think it's an interesting horizon, but also daunting. How do we actually work with this to make it useful for what we're trying to do in tertiary education, within our primary schools, early childhood and high schools as well? And I think that's where we're at with all of this. In terms of some of the other aspects, in terms of the trends, people expect to be able to work, learn and study whenever and wherever. And again, I'll touch on this on a workshop more on Tuesday, but it's about the different spaces we actually move through. The abundance of resources and the relationships that are going to be challenged as educators. BYO technology, and I spoke to someone here just the other day about bring your own device, looking at assessment as well, and I think that's quite exciting for what you're doing at NUS. And this idea of personalisation, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the learning, the teaching and the place of learning, etc., as we go through. So as we all know, the internet is like this. Getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. How do we actually use that information for best advantage? How do we actually get our students and ourselves to actually monitor what we're looking at and how we're using the information for best use in education? And I think these are some of the digital literacies I'll talk about in a little while. So it's an interesting concept of we've got an abundance of information, and if we're not careful it can overload us. And we have to be very mindful, as Howard Rheingold would call it, to actually attend to what is important as we go through. So, but who are these students that we're talking about? And I think this is something we need to start with. I'm talking about students here. These could be primary, they could be secondary, they could be higher education students, but they have certain characteristics that are possibly different from ourselves here at the moment. This is one of the students of the future, and I think we have to be examining what they're like. This is a little 1-year-old, and watch the hand gestures in particular. They're going from the iPad to a paper magazine, and they're trying to use the same sort of gestures. This one's interesting, where they're scrolling on the paper magazine, and in a little while they try to see, is this broken? It's not working the same way as that other device. So this one's one of my favourite, where they're testing to see the magazine. It doesn't quite work the same way as the iPad. Now watch the finger here. It doesn't work on the magazine. And then the little girl actually goes to a leg and says, it's working here. And then goes back. And as you can see, that they're fed up with the paper magazine, they're back to the electronic version. So again, not my daughter here, but for this 1-year-old, that's how they're working with this. And if you want to find this, this is up on YouTube. It's called Broken iPad Baby. Now, I call that rapport with technology, because what you're looking at here, this little child who's 1, and think about in 18 years, we're going to be teaching them in university, or they're going through primary school and high school. Now, what are they going to be needing to be doing, and how are they using technology? As you can see there, they've got a rapport with technology because they understand that they can use certain actions on certain devices, but haven't picked up the differences as yet. And I think this is where our students are at. We sometimes overestimate what our students and what ourselves can do with technology. And we still have to teach them how to use the technology in effective ways. And that's why I call it a rapport. I still tend to think we overestimate, and some research with next generation students has actually identified this. Some of the other characteristics of these new generation students: they generate content, everything from tweets through to videos through to photographs. And so they're learners as designers. So they're designing these interactions. Also too, with George Siemens' work, we're looking at the idea of connected students. So knowledge is in the network. I don't need to know everything about my knowledge area as long as someone in my network does. And this is a fundamental change in terms of what we're looking at with our students. They're connected in different networks. If they don't know it, they can find someone who does. And I think this is changing how we think about what we're doing with our education system as we go through. These are some of the characteristics I look at: that rapport with technology, generating content, the connected student. We're mobile, and I love the fact that at NUS you've got Wi-Fi on the buses, and I think that's extraordinary in terms of the mobility. So another level of mobility you can look at. And this idea of personalising and adapting our space to their needs or to our needs. So they own this place of learning, and we're very nomadic in how we actually learn. So very different characteristics for the students that we're actually looking at. If we look at the digital literacies landscape, and this is very interesting, I'll go from, if you like, the micro out to the macro. And what we're looking at here is different countries are struggling with this in different ways. In Europe, for instance, they've got the digital agenda for Europe. And what they're looking at there, make digital literacy and skills a priority of the new skills for new jobs. And again, a fundamental aspect, and it's a Europe 2020 initiative as we're looking at it. And I've got links here. If people do want these slides, I put everything up in SlideShare, and you can actually download the PDF. And that's why I put the URL there, so you can go back to the actual resources in terms of that. In Europe, let's look at that as part of the landscape. 73% of European households have access to the internet. What about the other 27%? It was suggested that a lack of skills is the second most important reason for not having access to the internet. So the lack of skills rather than the accessibility to the technology. And this comes, if you like, to the digital literacies. The next point is an interesting one in that they were asked in this survey 53% of the labour force felt that they were confident that they had sufficient digital skills to change jobs or find another job. So again, you've got 47%, and this is right across Europe, who are saying, I don't feel comfortable with the skills I've got to change jobs because I know they're going to need some digital skills and digital technology skills. Other ones, there's also divides with age, gender and education. And these are key challenges, and I would assume they're key challenges in most places. So older women, older people, women, those with lower levels of education tend to have lower level of digital skills. And this is within the European context. And this is a study done in 2012. Again, your ambitious agendas here in Singapore are very admirable in terms of the vision of harnessing ICT and transforming learners. And I think the big thing about what you're focusing on with the self-directed learning and also to the collaborative learning, I think are great initiatives in terms of that. And the MP3 there, Master Plan 3, has got some very, very great goals in terms of transforming education, in terms of the early childhood, the primary and the secondary school, and then filtering through to other areas. As well as in vocational education, you're doing digital literacy skills around Singapore. These ones here in particular I was attuned to in terms of nurturing our young for the future, the competencies for the 21st century. And I think with digital literacies, it's often used interchangeably with competencies. And the model that you've got there for the holistic view of the person that you're developing and looking at the technology that we can infuse and how do we actually layer that in, I think is very important. Your two major works on self-directed learning with ICT and collaborative learning with ICT, I think are as useful in higher education as they are in the school sector. And great books and things. I haven't dived into them in a deep way, but in terms of the processes and the examples they provide, I think are great in terms of the landscape that you're looking at within Singapore. So what do we do with this landscape in terms of we've got students who are changing the way they interact with technology and learning and interacting with other people. We've got different ways that they're learning now in terms of technology and different aspects. This is an initiative from UNESCO in terms of working with teachers, looking at three major ones: the technology literacy, the knowledge deepening and the knowledge creation. And these are aligned with these 6 aspects of a teacher's work, which I think is a nice approach in terms of doing that. Very big picture in terms of the UNESCO ICT competencies as they go through. But the big thing about this, it's not an easy space to actually work in. Literacy, as we know, is a contested concept or a contested space. So literacy is at present recognised to be a plural and dynamic concept. And it's a continuum, if you like, of where we actually work with our literacies. The big thing about it, it changes depending on our needs and our environments that we actually work in. And there's no single notion of literacy as a skill which people possess. So what's a way forward in terms of this when we're looking at digital literacy? And I'll expand on this in a moment as we go through. Again, no universally accepted definition of media literacy, information literacy, digital literacy, or even media itself. And as we know, the playing field is changing dramatically as we go through. And I think this is the interesting part about it. It is a very contested concept as we look at it. We're no longer talking about a digital divide of access. It's about skills now. And what we're looking at is this information literacy divide. And I think this is very telling. Those who don't have the skills can't go on to actually learn in that environment. And I think this is where digital literacies have to be pervasive throughout all curriculums that we look at in schooling and society as well, so that we don't have this divide that's going to occur with this. It's going to be important at all levels, all ages, all levels of education as we go through. So again, I think these are some of the concepts that we have to be careful with in terms of creating other divides, by upskilling certain people to actually engage in these environments. And that's where it has to be done at all levels in terms of this. Again, the landscape that we're looking at, this is another one, and I've got some links there. Steve Wheeler in the UK talks about these sorts of skills in terms of digital literacies. He talks about the idea of social networking skills, the use of Twitter and so forth, blogging, Facebook, etc. The transliteracy skills he talks about look at the affordances, if you like, of technology and how we actually use it. The big thing in the future, we're going to need to maintain privacy. And how do we actually create an identity where we have privacy and we're careful in this new environment? And we all know those situations. Classic, I don't know if you know it, it's a piece of software that some of the students, at least in Australia, use, and I'm sure they do here, called Snapchat. And what you can do is you can send an image to someone, but in 30 seconds that image actually disappears. And so you can imagine the students using it don't want that image to last for very long. But again, it creates different types of interactions. And that's where the privacy and the safety need to come into play. Creating content is very important, as we know. So when we create photographs, when we create blogs, when we create tweets, all of these we're looking at learners as designers as we go through. Organising and sharing content, repurposing, reusing, filtering, selecting content, self-broadcasting in terms of that, and I think it's particularly interesting as we go through. And I'll do a little bit of a survey here in a little while about what people use certain types of technology as we go through. So that's the Wheeler concept of digital literacies, looking at the landscape. And this one here, another model which I think is particularly useful. Looks at the cognitive, the technical, the social, emotional, with the digital literacies in between. The reason I like this model is because it doesn't just look at the technical side, and it looks at critical literacy and multi-literacies, the social, emotional literacy as well in terms of that. And I think these are very important in terms of this particular space as we go through. So what do we mean by literacies in terms of this environment, the digital literacies, or what's the, if you like, the definition that I lean towards? And it's about no longer the ability to read and write, but now the ability to understand information however presented. And we have to deconstruct that down into these subset of skills as we go through. One of the other things we need to look at is we can't assume students have the skills to interact in this digital age. And I think that's one of the things a lot of the research is actually showing. They're very savvy when they use Facebook, Twitter, their social media and so forth, but they still need to be taught to how to use it in teaching and learning. And I think this is the interesting thing about it. Also too, for teachers, the literacies will allow us to teach more effectively in this digital age. And that's some work that's being done by JISC in the UK as we go through. And that's the definition I tend to lean towards, about understanding information however presented as we go through. Okay, so what's the focus then? And I'll drill down to some of the work that we're doing within the Australian Digital Futures Institute. Just to let you know, I've been there 1 year next Monday, so the agenda and the strategy we're still developing, but digital literacies are front and centre of what we're trying to examine. I do see it as a core issue that we need to focus on in all levels of education, but particularly higher education as we go through the space that I mainly work on at the moment. Here you go, just to see another side of things.
Is very multi-focused. I think the Australian Digital Futures Institute, and the name suggests what we're looking at. Digital Futures suggests we're looking into the future with digital technologies. The nice thing about that focus is that we can actually apply that particular area to every discipline area at USQ and a lot of areas outside of the university. The main focus that we're looking at is digital literacies. And we look at the idea that in the future we're going to need different sorts of literacies to be able to work, play and live. And so some of the sorts of literacies we're talking about are things like personalising our learning, being able to actually work in communities of practice online, Also to being mobile and still being able to engage with our families and our work and so forth. And also spaces, moving through learning spaces. So we focus very much on those 4 key areas of digital literacies, but we're again, I suppose the focus is the literacies for the future. What's it going to be like to live and work and play in 10, 15 years' time? And so we're examining that from many different dimensions. Added to that, if you like, there's the fact that we look at digital identity, digital economy. We look at also too the ideas of digital inclusion and also digital society. So the projects and things that we focus on are the intersection between digital literacies and also to these platforms and that focus on these areas of identity, inclusion, economy and also society as we look at things as well.
It gives a bit of a brief then to what we're looking at in the Institute. And as you can see there, the way we're defining digital literacies is personalised learning, mobility, digital communities and spaces. So we're actually underneath those subsumed many different concepts and literacies that go into those areas. The platforms, if you like, are the identity, inclusion, economy and society. And all of the projects that we're looking at are trying to focus on this intersection to actually examine some of these. Just to give you a little bit of a handle of how we're examining some of the digital literacy sort of agenda as we go through. So some of the projects here we mentioned at the start about the Digital Futures Collaborative Research Network. This is a project between 3 universities. It's got about 90 researchers involved. Looks at the idea in one of the projects, mobility. How do we actually look at being mobile and learning in a mobile environment? Other ones are looking at the use of mobile technology with agriculture and different areas as well. The next one here, and we're chatting about this over lunch as well. This is a regional universities network project. It involves 6 universities. And it's a maths and science digital classroom. In Australia at least, a lot of students in grade 9 and 10 are not being enthused by mathematics and going on to grade 11 and 12, which means that the teachers are not being trained to come back into this system. And so there's, if you like, a vicious cycle of what's occurring. So we're focusing on trying to actually look at coming up with some high-end sort of interactions. We also look at in aged care, community education, research and training. The use of technology there is particularly interesting and the literacies that we would need. What they're doing in the aged care sector is trying to keep people in their homes for longer, using technology to monitor. And we're talking about some of those today, about heart arrhythmias and so forth with some applications. So you can actually monitor and as you go into your house, basically be monitored to see how you're going about and how healthy you are at that time. Other projects we look at are the networks across different associations. And these are across Australasian tertiary associations. And also 2 projects on access as we go through there as well. So as you can see with the digital literacies agenda, we're trying to examine it from different perspectives. And I think that's the interesting part about that in terms of the types of projects that we're actually examining. So what are some of these literacies? And I'll look at these briefly because I'm going into more detail later next week in terms of the personalised learning. This is an interesting concept and I think it's very much a skill that we need to look at for 21st century. Whether you've got early childhood students, primary, secondary, university students, I think this is what we need to do in terms of the literacies. It's not teaching them the skills, it's teaching them the strategies about how they can learn. And I think this is the big change that we need to look at. More towards the learner autonomy, more towards the self-directed learning as we go through. So with personal learning spaces, what we're doing is integrating these formal spaces and informal learning spaces. And so we're putting them together in terms of it. They're being customised by the individual to suit their needs, and they're allowing individuals to create their own identities. And we know that already, that sometimes your virtual presence is as important as your physical presence. The big thing about personal learning spaces, personal learning environments, personalised learning is that it's ongoing learning, looking at the lifelong, life-wide learning that we look at as we go through. So it's something for life. looking at the idea of e-portfolios, giving them to students in a university setting and allowing them to populate that e-portfolio even after they've finished their degree. So it becomes a life journal, if you like, which they can actually display and output for different reasons. And I think the e-portfolio is a nice move towards personalising our learning. Other things that we look at as well is the theory of connectivism, George Siemens' work. Knowledge has changed to networks and ecologies, and I think this is particularly different, that knowledge is in the network, but we need better skills in terms of the communication that we're looking at as we go through. So connectivism is the assertion that learning is primarily a network forming process. Again, a lot what I'm doing here today, coming from another place, networking, looking at different ideas, meeting with lots of people at the university on different ways and seeing what you're doing in terms of your projects, hopefully infusing some ideas into there as well. So the networking forming process is going to be more crucial in the future. And I think one of those life skills, or literacies if you like, that we're going to need in the future as we go through. What I like to do is map out my own personal learning spaces every now and again, and this is a mind map of that. And it's quite telling because it actually does show you some of the things that are occurring. If you look at the search at the top, you can see the types of things that I would go to, Google, Wikipedia and so forth. If you look at the communication aspects, mobile, teleconferencing, all the way through, there's a lot of them there. That's because I tend to be a people person. I like to keep in contact. So although people tend to think that technology may be taking us away from people, I see it as a way of connecting and using the devices in different ways. I don't think I could live without Skype in terms of interacting with people around the globe. I use SMS for quick messages. And the interesting part about these tools, they're used in different ways. Some of the farmers in Western Queensland, they use SMS instead of email. And there's a good reason for that. Instead of sending an email, which you can ignore, an SMS, if you know your phone, it comes up on the front. You have to do something with it, even if you don't want to read it. So there's a different affordance of this particular communication device. So they use SMS when they want to get hold of someone. And then the other devices as well, Facebook, LinkedIn, SlideShare, etc. In terms of the tools and things, you'll see there I tend to use Mac and I take photos. The TomTom and the Garmin are there because wherever I go I like to use GPS systems. The Garmin is for running and so forth. You can track distances and speed and so forth. So again, you get a bit of a sense of the spaces that I reside in. The software that I use, Inspiration for concept mapping, Photoshop, Keynote, etc. But probably the fundamental change that has occurred with me is in the distributed spaces. Because I get invited quite a bit to go to different places, the spaces that I actually do my work in change. So there's the university, obviously, there's the home office, there's airport lounges, there's cafes and there's hotels. But what I'm doing is I'm actually moving through those spaces for different reasons. The cafes, for instance, is an interesting one. When I want a busy environment and want to be, if you like, inspired by lots of people and lots of noise, I go to a cafe to do the work that I need to do. When I want a quiet spot, I go somewhere else. Airport lounges allow you to actually do the work and watch people at the same time, and every now and again take a break. So there's different affordances of those spaces as we go through. So if you like, that's some of the personal learning spaces that I reside in. And it's a great activity to do both as a teacher and as a student to actually start to map this in terms of what we look at in terms of that. So they're the personalised learning spaces, if you like. And what I want to go into now is spaces in general, how these are changing in our education system. That learning is not place-based now. Place and space are being interchanged, and place is becoming less important, or the singular place that we're looking at. Now this is a project we looked at in terms of spaces for knowledge generation a couple of years back, where we looked at the way students use space and the new spaces you have at the university here are incredibly impressive in terms of the rooms and the spaces where students reside around the residential colleges. And I think they're to be admired in terms of creating spaces that students can use. Now, this is what I use in terms of spaces for a definition. Physical, blended or virtual areas that enhance learning. So identifying a space that will enhance that learning, that motivate learners. And I think some of the spaces you've created, the physical spaces, can't help but do that. But how do we infuse this into the virtual areas as well? Promoting authentic learning interactions, I think, is really important. And the big thing about spaces, and this is the interesting one, unless we perceive that we can use a space in many different ways, we're only going to use it in the way that we know. It might be the one or two ways in terms of using this space here. I might come into this space here, and although it's a lecture room format, I might think I can do 10 different ways of learning and teaching. Not always as conducive because the chairs may not turn around and so forth, but I can perceive that. And then there's actual affordances of the space that may prevent me or assist me. And I think this is something important in terms of using those spaces. So we have to think about the physical space and how we can use that in the virtual areas as well. And that's where blended learning is a very palatable approach to learning and teaching, because you're in both physical and virtual spaces and you're picking the right ones in terms of how you actually go about that. So what are some of these spaces that we look at? The distributed learning spaces, as I call it. And there's both physical, there's virtual, you've got the blended in the middle, you've got the formal, informal for both of those. These other spaces as well in terms of the mobile, the personal that we've spoken about, the academic spaces, the outdoor spaces, and the professional practice spaces as well. So these are the spaces the students reside in and move through as we go through. Now, why I've got down there academic learning spaces is because they tend to be different. I know when I was coming over here on the plane, and I'm sure most of you do this, how many times do you read a journal article or read different articles on the plane? And that's a hidden space for academics. The spaces no one sees, but you're actually working in that environment as you go through. So academic spaces are quite interesting in terms of the types of spaces we actually work in as we go through. Here's some spaces here, and I put your IVLE here. We've got the formal virtual learning spaces. Moodle is a big one in Australia. Blackboard, most people would have heard about. I know you've got your own homegrown version, IVLE, which has been going for 15 years. You also got these informal spaces, and these are the ones, the Flickr, the YouTube, the Facebook, the Blogger, and so forth. And I'm just curious about this, just in the audience. How many people have uploaded photos to Flickr from the audience? Okay, so small percentage, okay. How many people have gone to YouTube to watch a video? Okay, large variety. Now let's look at, if we look at, remember the characteristics of new generation students, how many people have uploaded the video to YouTube? Okay, again, reasonable variety there, probably with your learning and teaching or outside as well, but again, less in terms of the numbers. How many people use Facebook? Obviously, most people in the room would put that up. The metaphor I use for Facebook is like a barbecue in Australia, because you invite your friends around, you have a barbecue, you have a chat, you finish the barbecue, and you go away. And so it's a social environment, and it's mainly used with family and connections. And it's a particularly interesting one. How many people have got an active blog? Okay, an active blog that you write in, say, once a week. So 4 or 5 people here. Again, more of a commitment in terms of being reflective on that as you go through. How many people, say, tweet 5 times a week? Okay, 1, 2, okay. So a small percentage again, which is interesting. Okay, so using Twitter, which 140 characters, so you have to be succinct to actually get your message out in terms of it. And interesting in terms of that. For those, how about LinkedIn? How many people have got a LinkedIn presence? Okay, good. And that's about the same as what I would see in most audiences. It's like the boardroom or the meeting room for academics and people in higher education. It's a place you kind of have a presence there, if you like, in terms of that. How many people use SlideShare, by the way? If you could put your hand up. Okay, one or two. Okay. And SlideShare, this presentation, if you like, I've uploaded it, and you can freely go there and download it. I've got about 70 or 80 presentations, so if you're interested in some of the concepts here in terms of that, you can do that. Now, what's coming about with all these bits of software is the aggregation. I use SlideShare, but then I tweet to my communities that I put a SlideShare up. It then goes to Facebook, it then goes to Twitter, and then so other people can actually then use it if they want to. In LinkedIn, the slides go into there as well. So I've connected a lot of these different devices to make it useful for my academic work as we go through. So these are some of the different spaces that we're starting to reside in as we go through. Okay, one of the other themes then I want to come back to is this idea of mobility. And again, I call this one of the digital literacies that we're examining. We all know it's here and now. We have mobile phones, we have the iPads, we have the tablets and so forth. But what has driven this? It's more to do with our movement, the global mobility, as well as the mobility of people, as well as clever people coming up with the technologies. But I do tend to think because we're moving more and we're much more globally mobile, that the devices are supporting what we're doing. How are we adapting our teaching and learning? How are we adapting our assessment? I know at NUS you've got a particularly advanced stage of using the mobile technology for your IVLE, and that's really unheard of in other parts of the world. So that's particularly good in terms of that, in terms of going to the smartphones and also to the tablet devices. In terms of assessment, this is the interesting one. And one of your colleagues is working on BYOD assessment, which I think is a great agenda to look at. Students bringing their own devices and then using it for assessment. And I know there's some trials that are going to be looked at in the near future. So again, I think we have to look at these devices and tools, see how we're adapting to these particular environments as we go through. Here's some stats for you on terms of the students in terms of some of these types of things with mobility. The fact that they now have a relationship with digital technologies. It's no longer just a tool, it's a relationship. And the amount of time we have the phone in our pocket or with us is quite extraordinary in terms of the timing of these digital devices. Portable devices are the academic champions, and 3 times as many students use e-books or e-textbooks, and this is in the US. 100,000 students, 195 institutions. One of the interesting things in looking at e-books, and this is one of the barriers it seems, and I often present to book publishers about this, is that when you actually buy real textbooks, sometimes, at least in Australia, students sell them at the end of the year. Now, they sell them, recoup money, they buy more books. Now, how do you sell an e-book? And it's very difficult, and the models are not quite there as yet. You've got to actually rent the book for 12 months, if you like, or for a small amount of time. So it's a very different model and very different look and feel that we're looking at for the books, etc., as we're going through. So again, some tensions in terms of that with real books and e-books, if you like, as you're going through. This one here gets back to that idea of spaces that we're talking about, that we're continually mobile. This idea of seamless learning, that the person experiences this continuity of learning across a combination of locations, times, technologies or social settings. And I think this is becoming more pronounced. The movement of students around NUS is like that. Going down to U-Town for lunch, taking the buses to get around the campus, being connected all the time as they move around, and your Wi-Fi across the campus is extraordinary. I think Ravi was telling me the other day it's about 1,000 nodes of Wi-Fi that you're looking at. So again, a very connected environment, how the students can actually be connected as they go through. How they use those devices and the literacies that they actually use are going to be the important part, because again, I do tend to think they have a rapport with technology. They haven't mastered all the nuances of it. And here's an example of this seamless learning, which you may relate to in terms of NUS as well.
My name is John, and I'm a third-year student at the Thruguna campus. I've set my alarm early today to make sure I get the best seat in the lounge room in the residential college. The lounge has a wireless network, and I compete with 9 others for a spot. As a typical student, I'm not really too interested in logging into the learning management system, but I would much rather send an email to my girlfriend who lives 200 kilometers away. I really miss her. And of course, I need to satisfy my daily dose of Facebooking. My housemates are also getting up. Looks like some have been out partying. Others just want to do a bit of last-minute homework, and I think some are just enjoying catching up over breakfast. I'm studying education, and it's a short walk across campus to my morning lecture. It's an old but cozy lecture theatre which fits about 30 students. Today's lecture is on independent learning. It has really made me think twice about how I should approach things. After my lecture, I head to the 24/7 Learning Commons in the library. I meet with 3 other of my classmates to discuss the latest assignment. It really helps to talk about it with others, but sometimes I feel so overwhelmed by the amount of work we have to do. Later, I find a quiet corner in the Learning Commons to complete the individual section of the assignment. I try to finish as much work as I can, but I realize I won't be able to complete it before lunch. Either way, I pack up my stuff and head to the Gums Cafe outside the Commons to meet my mates for lunch. We enjoy our meal, joking and laughing, and doing anything we can to distract ourselves from the fact that exams are approaching. Lunch is over, and I head back to the Learning Commons to look for some books and use Google Scholar to find some articles for my essay. I log on to the online discussion forum to clarify some issues with my classmates about the assignment. I'm hoping to finish it within a couple hours. I pack up my stuff from the library and call my girlfriend on my iPhone as I walk back to the residences. The best part of the week? Friday night drinks at the local pub with my friends.
So again, a very contextualised Australian setting, and this was a regional university in Australia that I used to work at. But you can see the seamless learning, the students moving through the different spaces, using different technology, embedding, integrating into what they're doing. And I think this is the trend that we're looking at as we go through. So where are we going to with this? What do we need in our education system? These new mindsets are probably one of the things, and I think we're part way there in terms of our thinking in terms of that. The idea that we're privileging mobile learning and teaching access, I think has got to be a given. Our students and our staff are moving, so the mobility has to be an important priority. The other one as well is embedding these digital literacies into all aspects of curriculum, learning, teaching and assessment. And I think this is a key if we're going to look at empowering our students for the future. One of the other things as well is not looking at different spaces in different ways, but privileging the diverse places of learning as opposed to the singular place of the lecture room, if you like, and other spaces as opposed to a singular place of learning. So privileging these diverse places. Other ones in terms of looking at assisting teachers and students to develop their own personalised learning strategy, I think is one of the big ways forward. So instead of actually teaching the skills, we're teaching the students to actually have the knowledge to develop their own pathways in personalised learning. So we're getting back to the learner autonomy, the self-directed learning, about how they actually navigate and work in these spaces. For instance, when I come into this space here, I can look at it in different ways. How comfortable is it? What are the aesthetics? What are the affordances of this space? Can we repurpose? All of these will go through my mind in terms of a learning space for myself. And by teaching the students these types of literacies, we can actually empower them for the future. So whether the space is here that they're learning, or whether it's down at UTown, or whether it's on the bus even, is irrelevant in some ways. And I think this is an interesting point to look at. This idea of privileging user-generated content. Students are used to generating and designing their own ideas. So the use of project-based learning, problem-based learning, the idea of creating artefacts is a nice way forward to actually engage the students as we go through. Okay, coming back full circle then. And this was a discussion we had the other day about beauty is in the detail. Each day brings new questions and insights, and the teacher is a perpetual learner. And I think this is the key of what we've got to look forward to in terms of education. So I'll leave you there and hopefully generated a few questions in terms of this area. I think hopefully there are more questions rather than answers, but it's such a big agenda that I think we all need to look at digital literacies as probably a key aspect of what we need to do in the future. So thanks very much there.